Once upon a time, you like how I'm starting this all classic-like? Once upon a time, I would begin each episode of DC Home with the words, "It's been a quiet week in Washington, D.C." But it hasn't. It hasn't been a quiet week. The President of the United States ordered troops to fire on citizens of the United States inside the United States. This has never happened before in more than 240 years. Sure, they were rubber bullets and tear gas, but, the president is already denying that much. In the midst of about a dozen national tragedies, we have a president with the situational awareness, temperament, and management skills of your average city pigeon. On crack. The folks at DC Home are aware of all of this, just as the rest of the country is. But their plate is already full. It doesn't have room for the national embarrassment that stole our presidency. Alicia's been sick now for weeks. Old Herbert pushed her wheelchair over to the Costco where there were so many frightened middle-aged shoppers that emergency services was out there in minutes. They gave old Herbert a number to call that would provide regular updates on Alicia's status and location. But the number never worked. Then the rioting began. And Tony made sure that everyone in DC Home knew to stay inside of DC Home. They're arresting people with masks. He gathered everyone together who was feeling up to meeting with him in the parking lot. Several faces were missing, possibly due to COVID, possibly due to a lack of cleaning supplies. The storage building was beginning to take on interesting smells. Sherry was certain he was wrong, of course. People were only wearing masks to protect their health. How could anyone be arrested? Sherry wasn't aware of DC Code 22-3312.03 on the wearing of hoods or masks, which not only makes it illegal for a person to protect their lives, but provides a masterclass on how to make a person illegal for doing something as simple as covering their mouth and nose. Tony told them, "We have to stay in here for our own good. We'll assemble teams for supply runs, but nobody should be alone." And so, DC Home was locked down. Imagine your own home or living situation during this pandemic. Imagine the boredom and discomfort and tedium. But you don't have to imagine it. You can just remember this week. Remember that cabin fever you experienced. Now, put yourself in a storage unit, in a 10-foot by 10-foot box. As you might imagine, isolation quickly turned to community, and it did so far above any eyes that might see them and a safe distance from the street. Sherry and Sean decided that they'd take their quarantine with them up on the roof, which is when they learned that everyone else also had that idea. On one side of the roof that afternoon, someone was grilling hot dogs. But as night was falling, they could hear the sirens and the shouting set against the last rays of sunlight. Sherry and old Herbert watched the city they had known for so long turn ugly. It had been turning ugly for years. And Sean, being a teenager, being a boy, expressed his thoughts on the matter. "I don't know what they're fighting about. The cops were arrested who killed that guy. Isn't that what they wanted?" The worst thing about having a child is when you have to explain things even you don't understand, that you can't know. You try to grasp it. You really do. But then they just end up asking questions, and you eventually have to admit you don't know, that you're trying to figure it out yourself, which undermines your authority, and then that's a whole thing, and you wonder what ever led you to wanting a child in the first place. Granted, that's a guess, because I never had children. But then, neither did Sherry, and that's basically how she felt any time Sean asked her a question. But this latest complete misunderstanding of the facts by her nephew led Sherry to an idea she'd never considered. She said, I don't know, Sean. What do they want? I know, right? Sean replied. He didn't realize that she wasn't just asking to make conversation. Sherry hadn't really kept up on any of Sean's homeschooling since his school had shut down, and don't judge. But this was the perfect opportunity for Sean to write, 2 pages, front and back, explaining exactly that. What did the protesters want? After several long minutes of fighting over it, Sean said, "It's not like I can go out and ask them. We've been told to stay inside." "So stay inside," Sherry told him. "You've got a powerful computer right in your pocket." Sean didn't think it was very fair for Sherry to ask him to use his phone for something like this. Sherry, on the other hand, was feeling pretty good about what she'd done, turning this moment in history into a teachable moment for her nephew. But, as it says in Scripture, pride comes before a fall. Actually, it says pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Proverbs chapter 16. There's also that whole part about the magic baby who was also God, who was also dead, but who also lived forever and ever. So we'll do what everybody else does and read that book very selectively. That's what Sean did with pretty much every book he ran into. And he ran back to Sherry within an hour. He'd filled those pages front and back with a rather largely fonted scrawl that spoke in the most general sense about how black people in America want justice. Sherry considered as she folded up Sean's papers. Why? What do you mean? Just that. Why? It took a few hours, on and off, for Sean to understand exactly why Sherry could ask him why, but he didn't think it was right. The next morning, Sean brought Sherry another couple pieces of paper. This time, he explained the death of George Floyd, writing that black people were obviously upset because this guy was choked to death in broad daylight, which is something people had never seen before. Nobody had ever seen a black man killed by police? Sherry questioned. Sean wasn't falling for that, though. No, people still get shot. Black people get shot. My mom and dad got shot. Everybody gets shot? Sherry asked. Sean agreed. Everybody gets shot. Bullets, and not democracy, it appeared, were the great leveler. Sean was old enough to know that plenty of black people were shot by police. He didn't think it was fair to segregate them. Let's try to ignore the poor word choice there, because his white parents were no more bulletproof than Breonna Taylor or Philando Castile or Freddie Gray or Tamir Rice or Michael Brown or so many others. So many African American folk had been shot and killed by police, Sean explained, it wasn't fair to make him have to write about all of them unless they were going to write a paper about his parents, which Sean knew they couldn't do. Okay, Sherry agreed. Let's make this fair. Let's just talk about the choking. Are you sure George Floyd was the only one? Sean wasn't going to fall for that. I'm sure someone used a chokehold at some point in history, Sherry. I guess someone had to research it and develop it, but so what? Am I supposed to research everyone who has ever been choked? Fortunately, Sherry wasn't asking for that. No, she said. Just tell me if there's anyone else. The key in convincing any young man to do something they don't want to do is boundaries. Clearly set boundaries. Young men like to know exactly what they're in for, exactly what's expected. As you might imagine, Sean was a little irate. And then he read about Eric Garner, who was choked to death for selling cigarettes. When he brought Mr. Garner to Sherry's attention, it wasn't with the smug certainty of a child who had put an assignment behind him. When old Herbert found him up on the roof that night, staring towards the southwest, towards the National Mall, Sean told him about all the other names he had needed to sort through. Shootings and beatings, people in their homes, or at work, or buying groceries, or just walking down the street. And the worst part was that it didn't end there. Because in order to find Eric Garner, Sean had been forced to read through article after article, wiki page after wiki page. He learned far more about institutional racism, specifically just in regards to the number of dead. This is just those we know about, he said to old Herbert. It's just the ones that someone wrote about. More than 600 in 2014 when Eric Garner was, They got numbers for every year. He pulled something up on his phone. More than 600 in a couple of years before that. Nearly 300 a couple of years before that. It's not getting better. It just seems to be getting worse. And they got numbers for the 90s and the 80s and the 70s. I couldn't find any before the 70s. I guess they didn't keep track before the 70s. Old Herbert explained what little he knew about the Civil Rights Act of 1960. Figured that might go a way towards explaining why the tracking of black deaths at the hands of mostly white police officers didn't begin until the 1970s. Oh, there were plenty of killings before then, don't be mistaken, old Herbert explained. But for something like that to make the news, the killing would have to be pretty bad. That meant that many, as a consequence, were simply ignored, forgotten. Then he explained lynchings and Jim Crow. And by the time old Herbert had worked his way back to the beginning of the 20th century, it was unclear how any black man or woman had survived. And old Herbert explained all of this in the best Mike Tyson impression you can imagine. I won't do it for obvious reasons, mostly because I don't do a very good Mike Tyson. Sean didn't know who Mike Tyson was, though he had seen his show on Adult Swim a couple times on YouTube. Sean still couldn't understand how white pride was mixed up in all of this, but to explain how this concept of white pride is so intertwined with the way many white Americans took pride for far too long in having a position above another group, the antithesis of the American dream, would take a whole other episode. It took Sherry several days, and she's still not sure if she understands. Washington, D.C. has its hands in all our homes. And if Trump is marching troops through the streets, welcome to DC Home. Until next time, be good to yourself, be kind to others, and let's make this world a better place. This is Ken LaSalle, and I just wanted to thank you for stopping by for this episode of DC Home. For more information about myself and the work I do, I invite you to take a look at my website at kenlasalle.com. You can also find me on Amazon, Audible, iTunes, and anywhere you find ebooks, paperback books, and audiobooks online. That's also where you'd find DC Home Season 1, available in ebook and in audio. You can also find me on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube by searching my name, Ken LaSalle. And thank you, as always, for your support.